Alex Turner thought his peaceful lake retreat was untouchable, until HOA President Karen Whitmore stormed his dock with eviction papers demanding he remove his property and fines he didn't owe. Karen's arrogance and obsession with control made her relentless, turning neighbors' whispers and legal threats into a campaign of intimidation. But Alex had a secret advantage. He owned the lake, the dock, and all the permits, and he used that truth to confront her in front of the whole community. Just wait until you see how the courtroom showdown unfolded and why justice ultimately prevailed, leaving Karen's overreach completely shattered. I never imagined that owning a lakefront property could turn into a battle I didn't ask for. My name is Alex Turner, and for as long as I could remember, the idea of a quiet retreat by the water had been my dream. I had spent years shaping my little lake house in Minnesota into more than just a home. It was my sanctuary. Every morning I'd sip coffee on the dock as the mist lifted from the lake, the gentle lapping of the water against the shore soothing me in a way the city never could. It was a peaceful life, predictable and calm, and I cherished it more than anything. That peace, I realized, was fragile. On a crisp Thursday morning in early June, I stepped out onto the dock to greet the sunrise, only to find Karen Whitmore, the president of the HOA, striding toward me with an energy that screamed confrontation. She held a thick stack of papers in her hand, waving them as if they were a weapon. The words "eviction notice" leapt off the top page, and my heart sank. She stood there with that unmistakable air of self-importance, as though the entire neighborhood and every rule in it answered to her. Her voice cut through the morning air like a whistle. "Alex, you need to remove that dock immediately. Pay the fines and vacate your property by the end of the month." I froze, staring at her in disbelief. The cold breeze of the lake suddenly felt like ice down my spine. She wasn't just making a suggestion. She was asserting authority over something she had no right to control. For a moment, I couldn't process it. How could someone be so blind to reality? How could she stand there so sure of herself when she had no clue about the truth of ownership? It was more than anger that surged through me. It was the shock of betrayal. I had always believed the HOA was about community, about rules and safety, not personal vendettas and arbitrary authority. Yet here she was, wielding her position like a sword, threatening to strip me from a place that had been my refuge for years. Every fiber of my being bristled with the urge to push back, to make her understand that this wasn't just my house. This was my life, my sanctuary, and she had no right to dictate its fate. What Karen didn't know, and what no one in the HOA seemed aware of, was that I didn't just own the house. I owned the lake itself, the dock, and every permit connected to it. Years of legal diligence, careful filings, and a meticulous eye for detail had secured my position. The HOA could enforce neighborhood rules all they wanted, but when it came to the property lines, water rights, and permits, they were completely powerless. My hands tightened at the thought of her overconfidence, the arrogance that led her to believe she could threaten me with something entirely baseless. I wanted to scream, to shake her and make her see reason, but I knew better. This was a situation that required strategy, not impulsive confrontation. Yet the anger burned so fiercely that it clouded every rational thought. Every sneer she cast, every pointed accusation she made about supposed violations only fueled the fire inside me. How dare she think she could trample over what was legally mine? How dare she try to intimidate me into submission? To bully me from a home I had built piece by piece over countless weekends and summers. Standing there on the dock, the papers fluttering in the morning wind like a warning, I felt a mixture of disbelief and fury. The calm I had cherished for years seemed ripped away in an instant, replaced by the raw, almost tangible sensation of injustice. This wasn't just a disagreement over a fence line or a minor rule. It was a blatant overreach, a personal affront to everything I had worked for. And in that moment, as the sunlight glinted off the lake and Karen's words echoed in my mind, I realized something crucial. This wasn't the beginning of my defeat. It was the spark that would ignite my resolve. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She had no idea that every inch of that lake, every permit, every inch of dock space belonged to me, and I wasn't about to let her or anyone take it away. The anger was a storm inside me, fierce and relentless, and I knew one thing for certain. Karen Whitmore had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The days after Karen Whitmore stormed onto my dock were some of the most exhausting I had ever faced. At first, I thought the initial confrontation had been a one-off, a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with logic and evidence. I was wrong. Within hours, her campaign against me began to escalate in ways I hadn't anticipated. The smear was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Whispered comments from neighbors, knowing glances when I walked by. The occasional hesitant question about whether my dock and property were truly legal. Each look, each word felt like a needle slowly puncturing the calm I had fought so hard to maintain. By the second day, it was unmistakable. Letters arrived in my mailbox, thick envelopes stamped with the HOA seal, each more threatening than the last. They claimed fines I had no obligation to pay, deadlines I didn't need to meet, and violations I had never committed. Her words were precise, polished, and meant to unsettle anyone who read them. I could feel the weight of her campaign pressing down on me, the pressure of injustice settling into my chest like a physical weight. It didn't stop there. Karen called the county offices multiple times, reporting supposed illegal structures on my property. I knew it was a tactic to make the authorities question me, but the mental toll was intense. Even when my calls to confirm my permits and property rights went unanswered for hours, the creeping anxiety began to gnaw at me. The sense of being trapped under the relentless machinery of bureaucracy was almost suffocating. Then she escalated further, hiring a lawyer whose demeanor was designed to intimidate. He arrived at my doorstep with a briefcase, a stack of papers, and an air of smug confidence that suggested he thought this would be a simple victory. The way he presented himself, talking over me, implying I was in the wrong, questioning my knowledge of permits and property lines, was infuriating. But beyond the surface, what hit me hardest was the realization that all this effort wasn't about rules or fairness. It was about control. Karen didn't care about community standards or safety. She cared about asserting dominance, about showing that she could manipulate and frighten anyone she considered non-compliant. The psychological toll of her actions was crushing. I spent sleepless nights poring over every document I had, property deeds dating back decades. HOA agreements, water rights permits, and municipal filings. The hours stretched endlessly as I cross-referenced, double-checked, and verified every line, every signature, every legal clause. I had to remind myself constantly that I was on solid ground, yet the whispers and doubts planted by Karen's campaign threatened to erode my confidence. Even knowing I was legally right didn't shield me from the emotional strain of feeling isolated, of sensing suspicion in the eyes of neighbors I had once trusted. By the fourth day, exhaustion had settled into my bones. The anger that had flared the morning Karen first showed up had transformed into something heavier, more complex. It was a mix of sadness, frustration, and helplessness. Each threatening letter, each phone call, each whispered doubt chipped away at the calm I had built over years of careful work. I realized that this wasn't just a dispute over land or docks. It was a direct assault on my sense of security, on the life I had painstakingly cultivated. And yet, within that heaviness, a stark understanding began to emerge. Karen's actions weren't about fairness. They weren't about enforcing neighborhood rules or protecting community standards. They were about power. Every letter, every call to authorities, every hired advocate was an attempt to assert control over a place that had never belonged to her. That realization stung more than anything else, cutting deeper than the surface-level threats. She wasn't a simple adversary. She was a force determined to dominate, to prove that position and title mattered more than truth and legality. I felt both powerless and enraged, caught in the push and pull of helplessness and righteous indignation. Yet even in the midst of that pain, something inside me began to stir. The more she tried to crush me, the more I understood that if I didn't fight back, her version of control would prevail. And in that moment, buried beneath the exhaustion, the anxiety, and the relentless pressure, a spark of determination began to ignite. I couldn't let her win, not now, not ever. The pain was real, the injustice was undeniable. But it was also the first step toward understanding the fight I was about to face and the strength I would need to reclaim what was mine. Amid the relentless pressure, the hours of reading, double-checking, and sleepless nights, a single thought cut through the fog of anxiety. The lake, the dock, and every permit tied to them were mine. Not in some vague sense, not as a casual claim, but fully, legally, and undeniably mine. Every letter Karen had sent, every notice she had posted on my property, every call she had made to the county offices, all rested on a false assumption. that the HOA had the authority to dictate what I could or could not do on my own land. The realization hit like a jolt of electricity. I wasn't powerless at all. That insight sparked the first real sense of hope I had felt in days. If her campaign depended on assumptions rather than facts, then I could counter it, not with anger, but with the clarity of truth. The weeks of torment, the stress and the tension were no longer just burdens. They were fuel for a strategy rooted in solid evidence. I began planning carefully, imagining the moment when Karen's illusion of authority would collapse under the weight of reality. I decided the best approach was transparency. If neighbors could see the facts as clearly as I did, then the narrative Karen had been spinning would unravel on its own. I sent invitations to a neighborhood meeting, framing it as an opportunity to clarify questions about property rights, rules, and community standards. I anticipated skepticism, some doubt, and possibly a few defensive reactions. But I also knew that evidence was on my side in a way her accusations never could be. The day of the meeting arrived, and I could feel my pulse quicken as residents trickled into the small community hall. Karen arrived as well, her expression a mix of confidence and suspicion, clearly expecting that her influence would dominate the room. But I had prepared carefully. I laid out deeds dating back decades, water rights documents, permit approvals from the county, and maps clearly delineating property lines and dock ownership. I walked the audience through each document, explaining the legal foundation for my property claims in calm, methodical detail. At first there were murmurs, curious, uncertain, hesitant. Some of the residents had been quietly siding with Karen, unsure of the details, but their doubts had not been strong enough to resist the weight of her narrative. As I continued, however, the energy in the room began to shift. Eyes widened. Whispered questions turned into audible gasps. Faces that had once reflected polite skepticism now displayed surprise, disbelief, and finally understanding. Karen's allies, who had stood rigidly by her side, began to glance at each other nervously, recognizing for the first time that the foundation of their confidence had been entirely false. The tide was turning. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of real hope. The sense of isolation that had weighed so heavily on me began to lift as residents approached me after the meeting, expressing support, relief, and even admiration for the clarity and preparation I had brought. The injustice that had seemed insurmountable, the relentless letters, the calls to authorities, the intimidation, was beginning to crumble under the undeniable truth. Karen's influence was revealed for what it really was: overconfidence and assumption without legal backing. In that moment, I realized that hope was not a passive feeling. It was an active strategy. By presenting the facts, showing the evidence, and engaging the community, I could reclaim control not just over my property, but over the narrative that had been used to threaten me. Hope was a powerful weapon, one I could wield without aggression, without malice, but with precision and purpose. As I stood on the steps of the community hall, watching neighbors leave with newfound clarity and support, I felt a deep sense of relief and determination. The spark of hope had grown into a flame. Justice was not only possible, it was within reach, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to believe that the next chapter of this conflict would not be defined by fear or intimidation, but by truth, fairness, and the strength of standing firmly on what was rightfully mine. Karen's game of control had just begun to unravel, and I was ready to see it through. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a chill in the air, a stark contrast to the simmering tension that had followed me for weeks. I could feel it in every step I took toward the courthouse. The nervous anticipation, the lingering frustration, and, beneath it all, a quiet confidence rooted in truth. Karen Whitmore arrived as well, her posture rigid, suitcases of papers in hand, radiating the kind of self-assurance that comes from thinking you have power over someone else. I knew better. This time, her confidence would not dictate the outcome. As we waited for the judge to enter, I took a deep breath and organized the documents I had spent days preparing. There were the deeds proving my ownership of the lakefront property, the official permits for the dock, water rights documentation, and municipal approvals. Every line, every signature, every stamp was in order. Unlike Karen, whose case relied on assumptions and intimidation, my defense rested on facts and legality. There was no room for dispute. The courtroom filled with a quiet hum of expectation. Karen's lawyer began with a rehearsed speech, attempting to frame the dispute as a legitimate HOA enforcement issue. He spoke of violations and community guidelines and the need to maintain order. His words, practiced and polished, felt hollow in the face of reality. I could see the slight furrow of doubt appear on the faces of those listening. The foundation of Karen's case had begun to crumble even before I spoke. When it was my turn, I presented my evidence calmly but firmly. I showed the deeds, tracing the property boundaries for the judge and explaining the significance of each permit. I explained how every claim Karen had made depended on a false premise, that the HOA had authority over something they had no legal right to control. I could feel the courtroom's energy shift as the judge reviewed the documents, nodding slightly with each page. The tension in the room, heavy and suffocating in the weeks prior, began to dissipate as clarity took hold. Karen tried to interject, her voice sharp with frustration, but the judge raised a hand, signaling that the law was clear and that only verifiable facts mattered in this courtroom. One by one, her arguments fell away, unsubstantiated and ineffective against the evidence I had meticulously compiled. Every claim she had made, every threat, every attempt to intimidate me was revealed as baseless. The air in the courtroom seemed to brighten as the realization settled over everyone present. The truth was undeniable and justice had found its footing. The verdict was delivered swiftly. Karen's eviction attempts were declared without merit. Any further attempts to harass, intimidate, or misrepresent my property rights would result in severe legal consequences. The finality of the ruling hit me like a wave. Relief, triumph, and a deep, almost overwhelming sense of validation surged through me. Weeks of tension, anxiety, and sleepless nights had culminated in this moment, and the scales of justice had tipped in my favor. As I stepped out of the courthouse into the warm afternoon sunlight, the world seemed brighter, sharper, freer. The weight of Karen's relentless campaign, the whispered doubts, and the relentless tension dissolved in a flood of triumph. I had not only defended my property, but I had reclaimed my peace, my sense of security, and the sanctuary I had built on the shores of that lake. Her arrogance, once so imposing, had been dismantled with the quiet power of evidence, preparation, and determination. But the victory was more than just legal. It was a reminder of the importance of standing firmly for what is right, of the resilience required to protect one's life and dreams against those who would seek to control or intimidate. I felt an inspiration welling up inside me, a renewed commitment to safeguard my home, my lake, and the community I valued. I knew that the experience had strengthened me, given me a sense of clarity and courage that would carry forward. As I looked across the horizon of the lake, the sunlight dancing on the water's surface, I felt the deep satisfaction of not just winning a case, but of reclaiming my life, my lake, my dock, my home. Everything I had poured myself into was secure. The battle was over, and in its wake I found more than triumph. I found inspiration, confidence, and the enduring knowledge that truth, preparation, and persistence could overcome even the most brazen attempts at injustice. Karen Whitmore's shadow had lifted, and I was free, truly free, to enjoy the lake I had built my dreams around.